Funding for this program made possible by the Investor Protection Trust, the State of Alaska Division of Banking and Securities, and AARP Alaska. In today's program, we look at Alzheimer's and discover the many resources available from Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska. Now here's your host, Ann Secrest.
Hello everyone, welcome to AARP Alaska. Today our guest is Pamela Kelley, who is the Education Director for Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska. Pamela, thank you so much for being with us today. Tell us a little bit about your background and what journey did you travel that brought you to Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska?
Well, I came by a kind of a back door. I'm a lawyer by training and a legal educator by profession, but in about 2008, my mother began to present a lot of symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And so I came to Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska initially as a family caregiver, someone concerned about a parent who was displaying limitations in daily living and daily function that I thought were likely to be explained by some cognitive impairment. And so I came there first to learn. And then over the course of about 6 years, as I served as my mother's caregiver, I learned a lot through the agency and availed ourselves of their services pretty liberally. And over the course of that time, came to appreciate the importance of having education and outreach and support within our community for those Alaskans who are experiencing Alzheimer's and related dementias.
You shared with me a wonderful photo, so let's go back to about 1965. Let's take a look, and who do we have in the photo?
Oh, this is a lovely set of pictures that shows most of my family, father, mother, sister, and myself, back in Cleveland, Ohio, in the 60s, and moving forward, that's where we all lived and enjoyed a pretty traditional middle-class upbringing.
And then you were at the University of Alaska, Anchorage.
I was.
In which department?
I was with the Justice Center for a number of years, and I was serving as the coordinator for the Paralegal Studies program.
And then this photo, now your mother started presenting in about what year?
I would say 2006. I think that it became pretty apparent to most of us that there was a bit of a problem in her memory and her thinking systems when my father passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly it was pretty clear that he and she together had managed to navigate the world quite well. But without him by her side, she was challenged with many of the basic functions that allowed one to live independently.
There's a series of photos that I'd like to share
Sure.
that you shared with me, and we're going to share together. This is your mother, Audrey, in 2009, followed by her in 2011. Now you see a difference.
I do. I do. I see the difference in my mother's eyes, primarily, and also in the confidence of her smile.
And then we moved to 2012 and then 2013. And what do you see there in her expression?
I see a bit more of her reserve, her fear, and I certainly see that she's worried. She doesn't know what's coming next, and that sense of anxiety that was common for her in the expression of her illness is, I think, pretty pronounced in the photograph of her from 2013, which was about a year before she passed away.
What was your relationship like with your mother? Well,
we had a lovely relationship, but we had it at a distance. Insofar as I lived in Alaska for 30 years without her living in the state with me. But after my father passed away, I had the occasion to recognize that she could no longer live independently, and she graciously agreed to come and live with my husband and I in Alaska. And so for the last 6 years of her life, we were together.
What was that like?
It was an honor, but it was very difficult because many of the things that we came to expect of one another had to evolve as we adapted to the depredations of her illness.
Mm-hmm.
And so we changed in some ways, and in some ways we simply quieted the pace of our relationships so that what was available to us could be celebrated and enjoyed. And we had a lot of very wonderful experiences over the course of that period of time.
Let's talk about the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's.
That's easily understood if you keep in mind that the term dementia is a general term. Dementia is the equivalent of a significant decline in intellectual function, persistent over time, affecting several different areas of thinking, primarily memory in those who have Alzheimer's, at least initially. But those symptoms, which, the effect of different ways of thinking, different cognitive domains, there are very many conditions that can lead to the expression of those symptoms that we term dementia. One of those conditions, in fact, the most common, is Alzheimer's disease.
How many Alaskans are affected by Alzheimer's?
At the moment, the current estimate is in 2016 that there were 6,800 Alaskans. In addition, those other dementias might encompass another 2,000 individuals.
And how many in the country?
Right now, about 5.3 million.
Wow. You had talked about memory loss associated with Alzheimer's, but there's also other losses: language, balance, thinking, personality, behavior. So it's a complex package. It's not one size fits all.
It is, and the brain is so complex. And so as different sectors of the brain become involved in the disease, and the hallmark of the disease is that brain cells begin to atrophy, they begin to wither, they stop working, and then after time they shrink. And so we are looking at a kind of shrinkage and loss of brain mass.
Mm-hmm.
And so because brain and mind are so closely intertwined, as brain declines, it's as unique as each of us are as individuals. There may be so many parallels or common characteristics. Memory may be involved first and then executive function.
Right.
But the expression of that for each individual is individualistic.
It's different. You've got 10 warning signs that Alzheimer's may be present, but before we go over that, I thought we should just stop, and because there's some acronyms that always pop out for anyone who's dealing with Alzheimer's. And we're going to, and I've got a little slide here, we're going to define ADLs and IADLs, because those come up. You learned that very, very quickly.
I did. It was, as I was beginning to become more involved in my mother's care, I would have so many acronyms thrown at me, and I sort of retained this glossary of acronyms at one point because this was an entirely new vernacular to me. ADLs and IADLs.
So let's start with ADLs, yes.
ADLs, the A stands for activities. ADL, activities of daily living. And when we're talking about activities of daily living, we're talking about the basic activities. These would be the kinds of things that are necessary for us to function. So imagine as you're waking up every day, some of the basic things that you have to do. You have to navigate from being prone on a bed to being standing. Moving one's body is an activity of daily living. Standing up and walking to the facilities, being able to ambulate, being able to walk or move, that's an activity of daily living. Being able to use the restroom on one's own. Toileting is the term.
Mm-hmm.
Toileting is an activity of daily living, as is hygiene. Showering or bathing, being able to brush one's teeth. And from there, where do we go? Some of us, have breakfast, being able to eat, feed oneself. These are activities of daily living. The next category, though, is called instrumental activities of daily living, and these are more complicated. These are the ways in which we actually accomplish things beyond the basics. So something as basic as, to you and I perhaps, as being able to make that cup of coffee, or put toast in a toaster, prepare food, being able to manage our finances, being able to drive a car or arrange transportation. Those would all be called instrumental activities of daily living. So those are obviously all affected in the course of illness for somebody who's experiencing Alzheimer's or related dementia. And they're markers.
They're markers, and that's important because once you get into that discussion with the assessment of anyone who, the 10 warning signs, ADLs and ADLs will be tossed around and discussed constantly.
It's the IADLs that are affected first. And those, when we look at those early warning signs, you can kind of imagine how those IADLs are suggested or implicated when we start to see things like a lack of initiative, or the inability to remember, perhaps, that one has told the same story several times in the course of a meal. Those are the kinds of things that would suggest that we might have a problem.
Speaking of which, we do have the 10 warning signs, and there they are.
So let's look at, for example, number one, recent memory loss that affects daily living skills. Well, recent memory loss, I'm going to think of the daily living skill. This is a pretty complex one, or a pretty advanced one. Holding a conversation from start to finish while engaged in an activity like a meal. We have a social convention that says that we don't tell the same story over and over and over and over and over and over. Okay, well, telling the same story twice, from the start of the meal to the back of the meal, when there are many different people involved, and there may be side conversations, that wouldn't be alarming. But if there's two people at the table, and they're having that same story told more than twice, that's a signal that something is amiss. It might not be a signal that there's Alzheimer's on board, but it's a signal.
We'll be back with our guest, Pamela Kelly, right after this break.
The AARP Caregiving Resource Center provides an easy way to join an online community of caregivers, learn about local services, and connect with others who understand what you're going through. Visit aarp.org/caregiving.
We're back with Pamela Kelly, Education Director with Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska. Our generation, of course, we know Alzheimer's, we're familiar with it, but it wasn't that long ago, really, that it was recognized. It's been 110 years.
It was identified by a German doctor, Alois Alzheimer's.
And we have his picture.
And he was able to identify something interesting in the brain of a woman he'd autopsied in 1906. Yes, in 1906. In her brain, he saw plaques, a very plaquey substance, and he saw brain shrinkage. And he recognized that those plaques were a suggestion that there was something organic that had occurred that explained her presentation of dementia symptoms.
Interesting. What causes Alzheimer's?
Well, that's a very complicated question, and there is no simple answer. We are still just learning what it is that's likely to be causing it, but we don't have a definitive answer. We do know that brains that are affected upon examination, brains that are affected by Alzheimer's disease have two things that are very characteristic. One is that the synapses, the connections between neurons, are coated with plaque. That's a byproduct of a protein called amyloid beta that accumulates at unnatural rates in these particular brains. The other thing that we see is that within the brain cells, the neurons, there are big tangles that develop that mute the signals that are likely to be occurring in a normally functioning brain. And so the presence of both these tangles within brain cells and the plaques at the connections between brain cells lead to a neuronal death. Those brain cells begin to atrophy and then eventually die.
Let's look at some facts and figures. Pretty impressive list here. As we mentioned, it affects more than 6,000 Alaskans and 5.4 million people nationwide. Men and women are affected almost equally. 1 in 3 seniors die with Alzheimer's or another dementia. And this particular stat is quite frightening, actually. Every 66 seconds, someone in the U.S. develops the disease. By mid-century, someone in the U.S. will develop the disease every 33 seconds. Tell me why that is. That's quite a startling statement.
It is a startling statement, and it causes most of it to sit up a little bit stiffer and take notice. But in large measure, that's because of the aging population of the baby boomer generation. The cohort in the baby boom is a big one. And so as the senior population grows, the number of those that are affected, the prevalence of Alzheimer's and related dementias is also increasing. And the reason is really quite simple. It's that the largest and greatest risk factor that any of us faces in developing Alzheimer's disease is advanced age.
We're getting older.
We're getting older, and there are more of us. And so we see that also in the state of Alaska. We know that in the next 10 years, the expectation is that the prevalence of Alzheimer's in the state of Alaska, by 2025, we expect that that's going to be an increase of about 70%.
The last stat was interesting, that in 2016, Alzheimer's and other dementias cost the nation $236 billion. And now, going back to that previous stat, is Alaska prepared to take care of this cohort that is?
Well, that's again another great question, and it certainly has really important policy implications depending on what you mean by prepared. Are we prepared to have, oh my goodness, 14,000 people, 11,000 folks with Alzheimer's, 14,000 folks across our state with Alzheimer's or related dementias in 10 years' time? Probably not. Why not? Well, because we really don't have the volume of long-term supports in place from the standpoint of housing, from the standpoint of community supports, from the standpoint of economic supports for family caregivers who really do carry the vast majority of the burden of daily care for those they love who are experiencing dementia.
Yes, yes. Let's talk about you mentioned caregivers. Let's talk about the impact on caregivers. And in Alaska, there are approximately 128,000 unpaid family caregivers.
And I can maybe even drill down on that a little bit for you. That 128,000, there's about 33,000 of those individuals who are providing primary care for an individual with Alzheimer's disease. Those folks, by and large, are experiencing higher rates of illness themselves, higher rates of depression and anxiety, in part because of the social isolation and stigma that's attached to working with a loved one who has Alzheimer's, because it isn't all, or a related dementia for that matter, because it can be all-consuming. It's difficult to integrate into one's community when one's involved in making certain that the kinds of behavioral upsets that sometimes go part and parcel with providing care for somebody who's experiencing dementia tend to make you a bit prominent in social discourse.
Yes. So there's a lot of stress,
Yes.
In fact, you had shared this stat that among caregivers, 74% report they are somewhat or very concerned about maintaining their own health.
Yes. And part of that is because studies have shown that individuals who are providing care tend to get for themselves less basic medical attention. An easy thing to allow to slip is, that annual wellness check.
Yes.
And yet, the strain of providing care 24/7, 365 takes a physical, emotional, and mental toll.
Wow. Your site, your website, provides great advice on what people can do, 10 steps in planning for the future. And it's number one, get the diagnosis as soon as possible. Let's talk about those 10 steps.
Okay. Getting an early diagnosis is really key because once a diagnosis is made, one can begin to learn about the illness. And oftentimes they're going to need to learn about the illness from a source other than the primary care or the primary health provider. Finding out what's coming and the pace of time over which change is going to occur allows one to prepare, again, financially, legally, emotionally, in terms of building the social supports, identifying what resources are available to someone in the community, evaluating while you have the ability to express clearly what one's own desires are, how one wants to live over that course of illness. Early on, we can act as our own agents. We can act in directing and guiding how we want our lives to be lived. Because an important message I do have is that life is being lived. From the time of diagnosis until the very last day, we have lives to live. Simply getting a diagnosis doesn't mean that somebody stops living. And we need to make sure that we give them the full opportunity to participate and direct that life as long as they can. So getting that diagnosis early is really key. Educating oneself about what's likely to come and how one might be able to make the kinds of adaptations and adjustments so that they can have the best quality of life possible for as long as possible. If we don't plan for it, the likelihood is that that's not going to happen. It would be a very lucky person for whom that happened by happenstance.
Now, your organization provides great resources for family caregivers, and I wanted to share, it's not just one thing. You actually offer a variety of things. The ABCs of caregiving, you've got short workshops that are offered monthly on different topics. Let's talk about those.
We have a variety of education products, in essence, that are available to family caregivers. We do a whole different curriculum that's appropriate for professionals or the direct care workforce. But for family caregivers, ABCs of caregiving are any one of 30-odd 90-minute workshops that we conduct. And they fall into about 4 different categories. Information about disease itself, the nuts and bolts of caregiving. That would be things like, how do we accomplish bathing without a battle? How do you achieve good oral care when somebody no longer reasons their way through the necessity of good oral care? Fall prevention. Okay, those would be very much nuts and bolts. But also a family caregiver of an individual living with dementia becomes in essence the CEO of that little caregiving partnership. And so they need to understand exactly what it is that is within the range of their responsibilities. And then lastly, we give them a lot of workshops that address how to best ensure the highest quality of life possible. Whether that's does it take to have meaningful activities, mindfulness about what it is one is occupied with as we make our way through the progression of illness. So I would call those the quality of life series.
And then the Savvy Caregiving Program, that's a 6-week program.
That's correct. Savvy Caregiver is really it's an evidence-based curriculum, 6 weeks, 2 hours each week for family caregivers. And it talks about decision making, it talks about reading the signs, how to identify what behaviors might be, in fact, communication as to unmet needs and how we would better meet those needs. It simply helps any family caregiver who's living with someone with dementia to be better as their care partner.
And then very briefly, consultations on an as-needed basis.
Anybody, anytime can call us, drop in, and there is an education specialist available to sit down and either coach, problem solve, support that person with whatever the presenting issue is of the day.
I have to ask you very quickly about treatment. Are you optimistic?
I am optimistic that we will achieve within my lifetime disease-modifying treatments. And maybe even if we're really quite fortunate and we invest well enough, there will be a cure.
Our last slide, I wanted to put up the contact information for all your offices around the state. And then you also have on your website a place where people can go to make appointments.
They can book an appointment online. We have offices in the Mat-Su Valley, in Fairbanks, in Juneau, in Anchorage. We have an online presence that's growing more and more robust all the time.
It's great.
Yes.
It's wonderful. I want to thank our guest, Pamela Kelly, Education Director with Alzheimer's Resource of Alaska. AARP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan member organization with more than 87,000 members in Alaska. AARP is dedicated to enhancing the quality of life for all as we age. We lead positive social change and deliver value to our members through information, advocacy, and service. Thank you for watching AARP Alaska.
Funding for this program made possible by the Investor Protection Trust, the State of Alaska Division of Banking and Securities, and AARP Alaska.